Hi, we're going to view from here. I'm Matt Driskill, live, sort of, in Singapore. That's right, we made the big move from Hong Kong a long time ago, and we're now broadcasting live, sort of, from Singapore. Today we are continuing the SEC Speaker Series. We've got Stephen D. King. He's the Group Chief Economist at HSBC. The topic today, when the money runs out, the end of Western affluence. A little bit more about him in just a minute. Many of you know the SEC in Hong Kong. Many of you know it's a key stop on the itineraries of the most well-known people in the world who happen to be passing through the city. The View from Here is pleased to announce we've got the complete set of speeches dating all the way back to 2007, and we're uploading each and every speech from 2013 as fast as we can. Speakers and topics in the series include people like Mia Farrow, famous actress, outspoken activist on China and Darfur. We've got Bill Clinton in conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern-day Singapore, or the soft rock capital of the world, as I call it. And we've got people like Chris Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong before it was handed back to China. We've also got people like comedian, author Michael Palin of Monty Python fame, and we've got many, many more. Check back frequently on The View from Here to get the latest podcast. Don't forget, you can also log on to iTunes and subscribe to The View from Here, and that way you won't miss a key speech. Just go to the iTunes store, do a search for me, Matt Driskill, or The View from Here, and subscribe, and that way each and every speech should be downloaded straight to your iPod, your iPhone, your iPad. A little bit more about today's offering, the topic, when the money runs out, the end of Western affluence. The speaker, Mr. Stephen King, Group Chief Economist at HSBC, the big global bank. According to the propaganda I've been handed, Mr. King feels that the Western world has experienced extraordinary economic progress throughout the last 6 decades, of course. It's been a prosperous period, so extended that continuous economic growth has come to seem normal. But he warns that this era of continuously rising living standards is an anomaly. He aims to show that the Western world has made promises to themselves that are only achievable through ongoing economic expansion. The expected future benefits, pensions, healthcare, Social Security, for example, may be larger than tomorrow's resources. And if that point is reached, which promises will be broken and who will lose out? The lessons of history offer compelling evidence that political and social upheaval are often born of economic stagnation. Mr. King addresses these lessons with a multifaceted plan that involves painful, but in his words, necessary steps toward a stable and just economic future. Mr. King is Group Chief Economist and Global Head of Economics and Asset Allocation Research at HSBC. He's a member of the British government's Asia Task Force, and he writes regularly for the Financial Times and the Times of London. And he lives in London. Well, that's it for me, Matt Driskill. That's The View from Here. Stay tuned. The topic, when the money runs out, the end of Western affluence. Mr. Stephen D. King, Group Chief Economist at HSBC. He is next.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for coming today. I'm Keith Bradshaw of the New York Times, and I'll be your host today on behalf of the Foreign Correspondents Club Board. Before I introduce our speaker today, please, everybody, pull out your phones now, turn them off, or at the very least, mute them. There's nothing more irritating than having people be unable to hear a particularly choice or even unfortunate remark because somebody's phone is going off. So we want all these quotes to be audible, particularly as we now put them up all up on YouTube on our website. With that, I'd like to introduce our guest today. Stephen King is one of the best-known economists in Europe. He's the Group Chief Economist for HSBC. He also is a member of the UK government's Asia Task Force, so he's a particularly good person to be speaking today on his subject of when the money runs out, the end of Western affluence. He's only in town for a couple of days, just flew in from Britain. Please forgive any jet lag on his part. He's very kind to come straight here. And with that, I give you Stephen King. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for those kind words, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, apologies. I'm not the other Stephen King, just in case you're wondering who might have been coming along today. But my story is a bit of a scary story. As you heard, it's called When the Money Runs Out, the End of Western Affluence. I must define, first of all, what I mean by this, because, of course, in a literal sense, the money can't run out because central banks can print as much of it as they wish to. So you can keep going on the printing presses and money can continuously expand. What I mean instead is that the money's running out to the extent that living standards in the West are not rising at the pace that they used to rise at. Economies have slowed down to a really remarkably weak pace over the last few years, and we've yet to even grapple with the implications of this much weaker pace of economic growth. Let me give you an example of this, because this is an important year for me for two separate reasons. The first reason is the publication of my book, which I believe is available just over here. But the second reason is that I'm celebrating a particularly important birthday this year. It's not my 30th birthday, and it's not my 40th birthday either. And just in case you're wondering, it's not my 60th birthday either. It's somewhere in between. I thought I could look back over the last 50 years and just think about how the Western world has changed. And I wanted to focus here specifically on my country, the UK, although I do stress that the numbers I'm going to give you now are very similar for other Western countries. They're all roughly in the same kind of ballpark area. So in the first decade of my life, from 63 to 73, per capita incomes in the UK, living standards in the UK, rose by around about 37% over that 10-year period, a pretty big increase in a relatively short space of time. Over the following 10 years, from 73 to 83, there was an increase of only 13%, about one-third of the previous decade's increase. But that was understandable, perhaps, because of the oil price shocks of 73 and 79, and then, of course, the global recession that followed in the early 1980s. From 83 to 93, there was an increase of around about 25-26%. And from 93 to 2003, there was an increase of about 30% or so. So, all told, over the first 4 decades of my life, there was an increase in living standards of almost 3 times, which is a pretty remarkable story. Now, over the last decade, the one that's ending this year, the increase wasn't 30% or 20% or 13%. The increase over the last 10 years was only 4%. It was remarkably weak. People say to me sometimes, what are the chances of the Western world suffering from a Japan-style lost decade? And the answer is, we've already had one. The question now is, what are the chances of the West suffering from a second Japan-style lost decade? Yet, although we've had this lost decade, we haven't really yet quite come to terms with why we've had it and what the implications might be. So first of all, why has growth slowed down? Well, the most obvious culprit is the financial crisis, but that's not the only reason. The US in particular was slowing down long before the financial crisis. What I'd like to argue is that growth in the late 20th century was growth during an unusual golden age, which just happened to be a golden age, which was through most of our lives so far. If you look at the growth rates in the first half of the 20th century, or indeed during the 19th century, the growth rates were significantly lower than we experienced in the last 50 years of the 20th century. Technology obviously mattered, but technology has always mattered. It mattered in the 19th century, it matters in the first half of the 20th century. I'd like to argue that beyond technology, there were other factors which contributed to unusually rapid growth, but these are factors which are one-offs, and they include the extraordinary opening up of trade, particularly within the developed world in the 1950s and 1960s, and then on an east-west basis in the 80s and 1990s. There is a further widening of trade to take place, I think, in the future, but that next revolution for trade, I think, will come mostly from a south-south basis, from Asia through to the Middle East, through to sub-Saharan Africa, into Latin America. Not so much an important story for the West. Second big theme, women in the workforce, a huge transformation over the last 60 or 70 years. Third big theme, big improvements in education. And the fourth big theme, kind of dirty phrase these days, perhaps in the Western world, the growth of consumer credit. But each of these led to a one-off lift in living standards from a very low level to a much higher level, but each of them is, by its nature, a kind of finite process. You can achieve it once, twice, three times, but then beyond that, it all begins to fade. And it has certainly been fading over the last 10, 15 years. Yet despite this, we've continued to assume that next year will always be the first year of recovery. We have an optimism bias in our forecasts, which has now been persistent for a good decade or so. We always think we're going to return to the golden age, even though the evidence increasingly suggests that we are unable to do so. Now, during this period of stagnation, as I might call it, because we believed in quick recovery, we never made the right decisions about what to do faced with this much lower growth rate. And so we had, for example, extraordinary tax cuts from the US in the early years of the 21st century, yet to be repaid, if you like. We had extraordinary increases in public spending in many parts of Europe on the assumption that growth would be strong in the future. We never asked the question as to what would happen if growth ended up being weaker. How could we afford those tax cuts? How could we afford those big increases in public spending? And we still, as yet, have no answers. We're instead engaged in what I might describe as wishful thinking, a process of belief that we have some magic way of delivering much faster growth in the future. And in fact, in the book, I talk about Sigmund Freud, because he wrote a paper, obviously many years ago, which was called The Future of an Illusion. In this paper, he wanted to explain why people believed in God and an afterlife and heaven, when he, as it was an atheist, couldn't quite understand why it was that their belief was so strong. Basically argued this, that if there were two alternative worlds, one with the God and the afterlife and the heaven, the other with nothing, a kind of meaningless void out there, which would we prefer to believe in? His answer was, we obviously prefer to believe in the God and the heaven and the afterlife. And he argued that in this case, this was an illusion because it was a belief based on wish fulfillment rather than on evidence. And I'd like to argue that in the realm of policy making, we have a similar kind of illusion. We believe in a strong recovery because the alternative is rather unpleasant, but actually we have no evidence whatsoever of that strong recovery. Now, in the book, I looked at what happens when economies go ex-growth, and of course the most obvious recent example is Japan over the last 20 years. And Japan, actually, to be fair to it, had a pretty good time of it over the last 20 years because although it went ex-growth, it was able to cope socially and politically rather well. And one reason for that, I'd argue, is that because income inequality back in 1990, when stagnation really set in, was still very, very low. So to that extent, to coin a phrase used by George Osborne in the UK, the Japanese were genuinely all in this together. Whereas when you look at other countries over many hundreds of years, you find that when they bump into this kind of growth constraint, it's not just a case of economic disappointment, but also of tremendous political and social turbulence as well. And I use a number of examples in the book. The most recent example, I suppose, would be Argentina through the 20th century. Argentina in 1900 was one of the richest countries in the world, had enjoyed the same kind of growth as many other industrializing countries in the late 19th century, seemed poised to overtake some of the laggards in Europe, like, for example, Germany. And yet 100 years later, Germans are twice as rich as people in Argentina. And in Argentina's case, once growth slowed, it created a kind of series of political, social, and financial upheavals, which led to low growth being locked in for a very long period of time. I also look at the Peasants' Revolt. I look at the French Revolution. I look at some of the monetary upheavals of the late 19th century, and also austerity Britain, not after the Second World War, but rather between 1925 and 1931. And in each of these cases, you could arguably say that the economies went from what Adam Smith once described as a progressive state to either a dull or melancholy state. And Smith tried to argue this. He argued that economic growth was morally and ethically desirable, not just because some people got richer, but because even if a gap opened up between rich and poor, there was still a reasonable chance that those who were poor would still look forward to income gains over the medium term, that everyone could get richer even if the gap got bigger over time. Whereas in a dull or melancholy state, what we might describe today as stagnation or continued contraction, in those societies, one person's gain is necessarily another person's loss. It's a kind of zero-sum game. And in those kinds of societies, trust begins to break down, loss aversion starts to creep in, reform becomes increasingly difficult, and the danger then is your stagnation becomes a semi-permanent process rather than simply a minor cyclical downswing of the kind that we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years. And I think that there is a significant danger that the Western world has descended precisely into this kind of dull and melancholy state and struggling to work out what to do about it. So the near-term answer, it's monetary magic, it's quantitative easing of one sort or another. And this is absolutely fine, apart from the fact that QE has morphed from what was originally a kind of powerful antibiotic designed to prevent the Western world from going into a deep second Great Depression. It's morphed into becoming something more like an addictive painkiller. Nice to be on, but doesn't really solve the underlying problem, and also comes with nasty side effects, like most obviously the creation of financial bubbles, either at home or possibly abroad. So we've created a situation now where we appear to be stuck on these policy-making drugs, which perhaps are doing some longer-term damage of one sort or another. The reality, I think, is that growth will be lower, and the reality is that because growth is lower, there has to be a reduction in the promises we made to ourselves over the last few years. And these promises come in two categories. They are political promises, most obviously associated with the promises made in terms of pensions or healthcare or education, social security, or low levels of taxation, of course. Or they're financial promises in the form of the claims incorporated in pieces of paper, like bonds or equities. And I think the danger is that in the years ahead, we'll find that these promises are broken, but with a lack of political will in how to break those promises, they will create more uncertainty, lower levels of trust, locking in these dull and melancholy states for even longer. So what has to happen about this? Well, I think there are a number of reforms that could happen, but they're not easy. The first reform is to recognize that in the world today, we have countries which run large current account deficits that borrow too much from the rest of the world, and also countries that lend too much to the rest of the world who run large current account surpluses. Both are equally responsible for the imbalances that have been created over the last few years, but only the debtors tend to have to adjust. If we're going to have reform in the future, the creditors also need to have to adjust. That most obviously means that they have to be singled out for actually causing some of the imbalances and difficulties in the world today. And I'm thinking here of countries like Germany, for example, in the Eurozone, which run persistent large current account surpluses and don't think twice about what the implications are for the massive accumulation of foreign assets that's implied by running these current account surpluses year by year, and the distortions that are created for other countries as a consequence of this. A second reform in the Eurozone. If you want the Eurozone to survive, there probably will have to be the creation of some kind of political and fiscal union. But beyond that, I think you also have to have a recognition that the debtors are simply unable, incapable of repaying their creditors. There probably will have to be some kind of one-off debt restructuring, a bit like what we saw in the US with the Resolution Trust Corporation that dealt with the savings and loans crisis at the end of the 1980s. A third reform, the need for long-term budgetary stabilization, particularly in the US and the UK, where it's far too easy just to print money and avoid the question altogether. But I think here there's a case for thinking about a repeat of the Grand Rubb and Hollings Act of the 1980s, of actually focusing on the longer-term needs to raise retirement age, to reform health expenditure and so on the basis that by focusing on that longer-term story, there is a reasonable chance that people could then can plan for the future more easily and help to regain some degree of trust. Next issue on trust itself. Trust in the financial system is still very low. I advocate in the book the need for some kind of Hippocratic oath, or the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath, for bankers. Certain ethical and moral standards that are clearly being adhered to, and where they're not being adhered to, some fairly clear punishments for what happens in the absence of those standards being adhered to. I think also there has to be something to do with reforms from an intergenerational point of view. In the West, we have the boomers doing really rather well and have done well throughout their lives, effectively exerting their own political preferences at the expense of others in the population. And one big concern I have here is the impact of this on the young, particularly those who are facing the prospect of no job in countries like Spain, or indeed prospects of very poorly paid jobs in the years ahead. There has to be some kind of new, almost like a new constitutional arrangement that looks after the interests of the young. And finally, and this is a reference to my own sorry profession, economists. I think it's not terribly important, but economists, we have not really covered ourselves in glory over the last few years. And one reason for that is we've become fixated on the construction of quantitative economic models built on data only over the last 10 or 20 years, because that's the only data that seems to be relevant for making these models work. And what we've sort of concluded in recent years is that the models work perfectly. It's just that the real world doesn't, and that's really irritating. What we should be doing instead is saying, actually, the real world is the real world, and the models actually are rubbish. And so what we should be saying instead is let's focus on perhaps learning something about history, learning something about what happens when economies bump into brick walls, learning something about what happens with financial crises, looking back at the examples of the Peasants' Revolt, or the French Revolution, all those monetary upheavals of the late 19th century, and realizing that economic policy isn't just for the technocrats. Economic policy is actually political economy. And the sooner we recognize that and understand that economics is not a pure science, that actually matters for society more generally, the better society will be. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. With that, why don't we throw open the floor for questions. Please, if everybody would identify themselves and their organization. Tom Holland, SCNP.
Oh, thank you. Tom Holland with the South China Morning Post. Stephen, you mentioned that the creditor countries should be singled out, and you cited Germany as an example, but the most obvious creditor country, of course, is China, which clearly has benefited enormously from the imbalances
Yes.
in terms of its own growth. If we do see the West sink into this dull and melancholy state, what do you see as the outlook for China?
Well, first of all, China over the last 10 years has done remarkably well, despite the fact that the West has had this lost decade. I quoted that figure of 4% for the UK for the increase in living standards over the last 10 years, the lowest that we've seen over the last 50 years. Same is true of the majority of Western countries. China over the same decade has seen an increase in living standards of 130%. So what is clear, at least over the last 10 years, is that China, and indeed many other emerging nations, have been able to grow quickly, even though the West is disappointed from a growth point of view. Now, of course, you might raise questions about the quality of Chinese growth, in particular over the last 3 or 4 years, because of the focus on infrastructure and social credit, rather than necessarily focusing on exports, which was the big driver pre-2007. But nevertheless, I think we have seen evidence of a significant decoupling of the world economy over the last 10 years. As for the current account surplus issue, the reason why I focused on Germany was actually because China's current account surplus, as a consequence of the switch towards infrastructure, has come down dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years. If you look at the figures for 2007, I think the current account surplus was about 11% of GDP. It's now about 2% of GDP. So China, whether it wanted to or not, has made a significant adjustment. What hasn't happened so far is an adjustment from Germany, whereas current account surplus remains about 6% of GDP. And the peculiarity here actually is a peculiarity specifically within the Eurozone, which is that the European Commission has singled out countries for misbehavior on their current accounts if they have a current account deficit of 4% of GDP, but a current account surplus of 6% of GDP. Now, the stupid thing here is that if Germany has a current account surplus of 6% of GDP and is lending its money to countries in southern Europe, which is what it was doing prior to the financial crisis, then, of course, a German loan, which is 6% of German GDP, is much, much bigger as a percentage of Greek GDP or Spanish GDP or Italian GDP. So the peculiarity here is that the biggest country in Europe has a very large current account surplus as a share of its GDP. It must imply even bigger current account deficits for the countries in southern Europe who are the recipients of these inflows. So my concern really is that when you've got large countries with large current account surpluses, it necessarily creates imbalances in other countries that then create difficulties thereafter. I'd also note the following, and this may be relevant for China as well, that if you accumulate large amounts of foreign assets, the risk as a creditor is that the debtor, one way or another, doesn't repay. This can happen through default, or in China's case, it could happen through the US over a long period of time choosing to devalue. Because, of course, the big advantage the US has is it's borrowed from the rest of the world in dollars rather than in foreign currencies. So if the US devalues, the renminbi value of all those treasuries the Chinese have purchased over the last few years will be worth quite a lot less. So it will be a default by stealth by the US towards China. My point is really is this, that ultimately creditor nations think they're safe because they're somehow morally and ethically superior because they save rather than invest. It's like a very Victorian view of the world. When you look at the history of debt crises, a debt crisis becomes a big crisis when the debtor suffers from austerity, perhaps, but eventually cannot repay, in which case the creditor also eventually suffers. And that's a lesson from hundreds of years of history.
Okay, next, over here, please.
Hi, Rachel Cartland. I used to be a civil servant in the Hong Kong
Hang on,
government.
where are you?
Here.
Oh, there you are, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Well, first of all, can I say I'm a tremendous fan. I agree with every single thing you say, every dot, comma, and so on and so on. I think it's such a good analysis.
Thank you.
But
Here's a butt coming.
You're welcome.
You've softened me up now, haven't you? Yeah, I see it's coming, yeah.
But, you know, your prescription at the end, I'm sure, is a good one. But how on earth do you get there? You know, where's the hammer, the bell that rings out a warning or whatever? You know, yesterday I spent a lot of time on a website I found for the first time. It's called A Girl Called Jack. And it's a recipe web blog. But it's a blog of recipes by a single parent in UK. And the reason it's interesting is because she's got £10 a week, $120 Hong Kong a week, to feed herself and her son. Now, that actually, I mean, she's very adept at doing it. But even so, looking at what she was doing, I thought, that child is in danger of deficiency diseases. You know, you're not going, and she's typical. So what's happening in a society like that? Why isn't everybody up and raving and going, we must do something?
Well, there's an example from the book of this, which I think is interesting because economists tend to look at what they can predict rather than what I describe as the kind of pressure cooker events that build and build and build until something snaps. And I suppose one of the implications of my book is that something might eventually snap. And if I can just use this historical example to show how difficult it is to work out what's going to snap. It's back to the 1920s with the example of British austerity. Britain rejoined the gold standard in 1925. Winston Churchill was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. And he concluded much later in his life this was the biggest mistake he'd ever made because Britain rejoined at an exchange rate that was significantly overvalued. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because Britain was therefore in a roughly similar position to countries in southern Europe today, with overvalued exchange rates, and it had to follow a very similar prescription of continuous austerity year after year after year, with continuous downward pressure on wages to try to make Britain more competitive in international markets. It's a very similar story. The general strike occurred in 1926, which was a direct response to this, but didn't really work. I mean, the unions failed. They didn't have the right strategy. But then things happened in 1931 in a rather unexpected way, because in 1931 there was the beginnings of the Great Depression, of course. The consequence of that was that Britain's fiscal position deteriorated even further. Its exports collapsed, its trade deficit widened, and there was pressure on sterling, exactly the same way as we saw pressure on bonds in southern Europe over the last few years. The Chancellor, Philip Snowden at the time, came up with this remarkably draconian budget in September 31. Remarkably draconian. It pay cuts which were absolutely horrendous. The next day, the Times of London wrote a leader. This is a warning to journalists everywhere, of course. It was a leader congratulating Snowden for the brilliance of his budget. In fact, it was so tough that it would surely prove once and for all that Britain would stay on the gold standard forevermore, that the foreign creditor was safe investing in Britain, that Britain had credibility. So what I didn't really understand was, if that was true, and that was a strategy that was warmly received by the press, why was it that 10 days later Britain came off the gold standard? I just didn't know what the answer was, and I discovered in my research as to what the answer actually was. It was what became known as the Invergordon Mutiny. And this was a bunch of sailors who in the Royal Navy, who came back to port in Invergordon in Scotland a couple of days after the budget, picked up their newspapers, read the implications for their own pay cuts, between 10 and 25%. And the combination of this bad news and a bit too much rum led them to mutiny. And of course, once you've lost control of your military, the game's up. And that's exactly what the foreign exchange dealers recognized, to something that existed back then. They recognized immediately that was the case. And it became impossible to defend sterling under those circumstances. Now, my point about this is if you said in 1928, I foresee the Invergordon Mutiny, people said, well, don't be ridiculous. It's impossible to forecast, which it was. But if you said, this pressure cooker is going to build, this is deeply worrying, and something of that kind might happen, then, of course, it becomes a bit more credible. And the one person who did see this, of course, was John Maynard Keynes, who wrote in 1925 about the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill. And he was very clear about the way in which this was a sort of almost like an unfair process. And my concern, particularly within the Eurozone, and this comes back to the French Revolution comparison, that the French Revolution was a problem in part because the costs of the agricultural disappointments before the French Revolution fell entirely on the third estate. The clergy, the nobility, and the monarchy said, not us, we're not going to suffer at all. And in the Eurozone, you've got a systemic crisis. But the Northern Europeans so far have said, look, this is really a debt crisis for the Southern Europeans. It's not really our problem. It's not really our fault. But actually, it's a systemic design fault of the Eurozone. And that, I think, is something which endangers the stability of the Eurozone in the years ahead, which is why I think we've yet to reach a solid conclusion for the Eurozone currently.
But does that mean that you're getting to a position where you're sort of arguing something really awful has to happen before people do some more sensible things?
Well, I think if you look through history, reform tends to come about after things have got much worse than people can imagine them being. I'm not really a Thatcherite, but I do think that her election in '79 was an interesting moment of change. Not just in terms of policies change, because they actually changed beforehand, but because she had a democratic mandate to change the policies. For example, monetarism was adopted in Britain by the previous government. I mean, it was Jim Callaghan and Dennis Healey who adopted money supply targeting, not Thatcher. But it had no mandate for it. And of course, there was a winter of discontent that followed shortly afterwards. But it's only a consequence of that terrible stuff that happened that then gave her the mandate to do stuff that wasn't acceptable previously. And I would say that in terms of our political discourse in the Western world currently, it reminds me a little bit of what happened in the early 1970s. Terrible shocks came through, the economy began to misbehave, lots of inflation, little growth, that was the big problem back then, and no answer. And it required a change in the political framework and thinking to actually provide some kind of answer. I think we're still quite a long way away from that.
Over here, please.
Stephen, good afternoon. Nick Green. I've been a hat hunter for 18 years, and it strikes me that when people start to lose hope, when they feel their lives are no longer progressing going forward, that's when they're more likely to move towards more radical agendas. When you look at what's happening across Southern Europe at the moment, and you contrast that to what happened in Germany in the 1930s, how likely do you think it is that you could have the fueling ground for a similar repercussion on the basis that history repeats, as you said yourself earlier?
Well, of course, there are a host of differences. Germany was subject to war guilt, which is not something that's happened in Southern Europe, as far as I know. There was, Germany, particularly during the hyperinflation, was in a totally chaotic meltdown of a kind that we haven't quite seen in Southern Europe. The European Union provides, I think, some protection in terms of democratic institutions and legal institutions that didn't exist in the 1920s and 1930s. There's lots of positive things currently that didn't exist back in the 20s and 30s. Having said that, there is certainly, I would say, a rather toxic political change taking place in parts of Southern Europe, and indeed other parts of Europe, associated with the rise of what I loosely describe as increasingly far-right, anti-immigration parties that seek to blame foreigners and foreign countries for their own domestic plight. Now, in one sense, I can see why it's happening, because in the Eurozone, this imbalance between the interests of creditors and debtors has yet to be resolved. And when you simply ask a country to deliver austerity year after year after year, the history does tell you it's probably going to be impossible to persist on that path forever. So then the choice for Northern Europe is, well, do you live with the threat of the rise of these toxic political movements in Southern Europe, or do you instead do something about it? Do you want to preserve European democracy? And what I'd hope is that perhaps after the German elections, when Merkel, I think, will be freer to do stuff than is the case currently, there will be a move towards trying to create some kind of low-level fiscal union. There'll be a move towards creating Eurobonds and some sort of banking union. There'll be a sharing of the burden associated with the one-off debt restructuring, going back to that Resolution Trust Corporation arrangement. But in the absence of those things, if you subject a country to austerity year after year after year, the history of it doesn't look good. There are examples of really the rise of Golden Dawn in Greece, which is a particularly toxic neo-Nazi party. It's become a lot more popular over the last few years. The pressures in Spain for what we might describe as a kind of growing series of nationalist movements within Spanish regions, another particular issue. Not connected with the Eurozone, but nevertheless still connected with Europe, and therefore the EU, the rise of the far right in Hungary, another big story, and of course the fact that Hollande is doing so badly in the French polls, but he's doing badly partly because of the rise of the National Front. So it does bother me that faced with this sort of dull and melancholy state, the political ramifications may be a lot less comfortable than we typically tend to believe, and that's worrisome. And of course, when it comes back to broken promises, which is the theme of my book, we come around to breaking promises. You've got to do it in what's perceived to be a fair way. Because if it isn't fair, then of course the case for these more extreme parties to rise becomes that much stronger, unfortunately.
Down here, and then I'm going to take a question out veranda.
Richard Harris, Port Shelter Management. When I was a boy studying classical economics, if you printed money, that created inflation. You just have to look at Zimbabwe to do that. I could sort of see why in the short term that hasn't happened, but do you think we're building up problems for the future?
This comes back to the QE debate. Well, first of all, one reason for doing QE is because central banks understood, I think correctly, that the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, the banking system, was broken. And the idea of QE is to bypass the weak banks and inject money directly into the economy rather than through the banking system by lifting the value of asset prices. To an extent, that's worked, to an extent. The reason why it hasn't created inflation is partly because there's an absence of willing borrowers. Companies could, in theory, raise a lot more money than they are raising. And where they are raising money, they're often raising money only to pay their shareholders higher dividends or to launch share buybacks, which is not really what QE was intended to deliver. I think also QE has led to surprising sort of distributional effects, which partly explains why we haven't seen much in the way of inflation. Take the UK as an example. There have been two sort of broad effects of QE. It's had the portfolio effect in lifting domestic asset prices. It's also had an effect through the exchange rate. The sterling fell a long way, made Britain, in theory, more competitive. But actually what happened wasn't so much that Britain became more competitive. What really happened was that import prices rose. Headline inflation went up a little bit, not much by historical standards, but rose. But there was no impact on wages. So real spending power for most workers went down. So lots of real wage cuts over the last few years, which of course has weakened demand. Those who benefited from the rise in financial asset values included companies that didn't actually invest, and relatively wealthy people who certainly benefited, but typically at the margin tend not to spend their wealth. So what you've had is a redistribution of money in the UK away from wage earners to those who are wealthy. But typically those who are wage earners spend a lot of their incremental income, whereas those who are relatively wealthy spend very little of their incremental income or wealth. So if you redistribute in that direction, your overall impact on demand tends to be really very, very small indeed. One reason why inflation doesn't gallop away. Where there is a risk, perhaps, of inflation picking up is if there's a sense that the political pressure on the central bank becomes so intense that people lose faith in the central bank as a monetary institution. And hyperinflations are often caused because the central bank is prevailed upon by the government, not just to do QE, but effectively to fund an ever-rising budget deficit. So the government effectively says, let's increase the budget deficit by 5% of GDP, and we're going to fund that entirely by printing more money. That's where we get into the Zimbabwe world. I suppose one marginal risk currently, and it is very marginal, it's a sort of fat tail, unlikely event, but perhaps worth mentioning, is that in Japan, if in a year's time we discover that Abenomics has not really had much of an impact on the economy, what does Mr. Abe then do? Does he admit that QE didn't really work, that his three-arrow strategy hasn't really delivered? Or does he say, let's do more? Let's do unconventional policy. And you get closer and closer then to the kind of helicopter drop, the printing of money, the more sort of loss of faith in the central bank as an institution story, which then becomes more disturbing. But I say it's a relatively low risk at this stage. But that's, I think, why we haven't as yet seen a significant rise in inflation, other than, of course, inflation of financial assets.
There's a question out here in the middle, and then we had a question. Yes, here, please, and then a question over there.
Hi, Tony Samwine, TVB News. I just want to go back to the point you were talking about with the Eurozone and how you suggested that a low-level fiscal and political union might be a way to manage the systemic crisis there. Could you see a possibility, though, on the other hand, where countries just walk away, just say this is just unmanageable, they can't keep up, and they just walk away from actual, the euro, like Greece, Spain, Portugal, for example?
Well, the answer there is yes. I mean, look at the history of monetary unions, and the only ones that ever survive are those that have some kind of fiscal and political underpinnings as well. And the Eurozone was a half-finished project. It didn't have those underpinnings, which is why it was really rather difficult. I've got two chapters at the end of the book. The first one is unhappily called Dystopia, and the second is called Avoiding Dystopia. But in the Dystopia chapter, I talk a lot about this issue of the risk of the Eurozone falling apart. Not because I'm an advocate of the Euro, but rather because it's being created, and sort of unpinning it now is going to be incredibly difficult with all sorts of financial risk and legal risk and uncertainty about who owes what to whom and what certain assets are valued at. So yes, it's a risk. And I think one of the problems we have at the moment is that people focus on the European Central Bank and its so-called OMT program. In fact, it's saved the euro over the last 12 months. It absolutely has done. But I like to think about this a bit like, imagine a house in London. It has to be London because London's built on clay. But a house that's suffering from subsidence, got cracks all over the walls. You can solve this in one or two ways. You can do it the quick and dirty way, which will not last for very long, which is to come in and bring in a painter and decorator to cover up the cracks. Or you can effectively underpin it, which is a very expensive process, very messy, and it's not something you can do very quickly. I'd argue that the ECB is the equivalent of the painter and decorator. It's done a very good job at covering up the cracks, but it hasn't really dealt with the underlying problem, which is who takes the losses associated with the fact that the economy as a whole has done so much worse than anyone had expected 5 or 6 years ago, and this imbalance between creditors and debtors is still very, very extreme. So yes, the risk is definitely there.
Out here in the corner, please.
Robin Fox, I'm an associate. At what rate do you think US interest rates will rise over the next 3 years? How high are they going?
There is, of course, an assumption in your question that US rates will indeed rise over the next 2 or 3 years. First of all, the debate on tapering is interesting because this is simply lifting your foot off the accelerator, let alone putting anything on the brake. And already the US economy is looking a bit more fragile than perhaps people had expected earlier this year. It's back to the optimism bias I described earlier on, this persistent desire to believe that this year is the big year of recovery. And like previous years, this year doesn't look as though it's going to be quite so impressive after all. Secondly, the Fed, of course, is concentrated on this kind of idea of intermediate thresholds and forward guidance about when monetary policy might change. And of course, the thing that people are fixated on is the fact that Bernanke has indicated that 7% is the unemployment rate for effectively ending asset purchases altogether, and 6.5% might be consistent with the idea of raising Fed funds. The problem there is, first of all, that it may be that you might get to those thresholds and it still not be sufficient to trigger a change in monetary policy. And the reason for saying this is that it could be that the unemployment rate is falling because of a decline in the participation rate rather than because of a decline or a strengthening of the economy. So it doesn't give you the same kind of result. It might also be that inflation continues to fall away, so actually there's no point in raising interest rates under those circumstances. But beyond that, I think the other risk is, of course, that we don't actually get unemployment down to that kind of level. It's fallen a fair way over the last 2 or 3 years, largely because of the fall in the participation rate rather than because of the strength of the economy. But it looks currently as though the US is growing about 2% or so. And at a 2% rate, it just doesn't generate enough jobs to really take you down to that very much lower level of unemployment. So I wonder whether the debate in the US might be rather similar to the debate that used to take place in Japan in the 1990s, which is always the year after next will be the year of rising interest rates. And we never, ever quite get there.
All right, if we have one more question. But, okay, back here. I'll wrap it up.
Tony Watson, I'm with Lim Advisors. We're a fund manager in Hong Kong. Just to your point on current account surpluses, how would you propose those be attacked? Not to be facetious here, but to use your German and Greek example, do we force the Germans to start building shoddier cars and industrial equipment that people won't want to buy and eat more goat cheese and olives and drink more ouzo? Sorry for the facetious example, but...
I rather like feta cheese, actually. It's rather nice. So there could be a big market for feta cheese in Germany. No, on a more serious note, my point is this, that Germany, like other countries with current account surpluses, has a choice. You have a current account surplus not because you're competitive, but because you choose to invest domestically less than you save domestically. It's just an accounting identity. So if you invest abroad, you have to be aware of, you export your savings to abroad, you have to be aware of the risks you're taking. And I think the Germans weren't aware of those risks. They thought that their money was safe in Southern Europe because they believed that without any kind of currency risk, their money would be permanently safe. And that simply ignored the fact that if you get rid of currency risk, you end up with default risk instead. I mean, the US understands this because Detroit has just effectively defaulted. That's what happens. And yet in the Eurozone, people didn't understand that risk. They just assumed their money was safe, that a government never ever would default, whether national, regional, or local. It just didn't happen. So I think the choice was this for Germany. Wonderful export performance. What do you do with those revenues? Choice number one, you pay your workers higher wages. Then you spend more. And maybe you would import more from Greece or somewhere else, but you certainly would spend more. So pay your workers higher wages. Germany didn't do that. It kept their wages very, very low. Choice number two is to invest in German industry rather than investing abroad in pieces of paper. Germany didn't do that either, because German industry was apparently not very competitive, although they were exporting like crazy. Choice number three is to invest abroad, but in physical assets. So you basically say, well, we're going to build factories, whether it be in Poland or maybe Greece or in Spain or whatever, but you could do that. Choice number four is to make no choice at all. It's take the revenues and say, I don't know what to do with them. Just put them in the banking system. And ask the banks to give you a decent rate of return, which of course they'll find for you by taking more risk, which is exactly what happened in Southern Europe. So I think that the problem in one sense was that because Germans couldn't work out what to do with their excess savings, they did nothing. And the consequence was to create these distortions elsewhere in the world. Now, how do you stop that from happening in the future? Well, first of all, I think hopefully there'll be lessons learned over the course of the last few years. Secondly, go all the way back to 1944. There was something called the Keynes Plan, which was put together, obviously, by Keynes before Bretton Woods agreements came through. And he was concerned that in the future global economy, there'll be both big current account deficits and big current account surpluses. And it was important that both sides would adjust simultaneously. It's never, ever happened. It's always been a bias for the deficit countries to adjust, other than the US, which is so big and has a reserve currency, doesn't really have to adjust. So how would you get them to adjust? Well, one possibility is to get the ratings agencies to actually pass warning about countries with excessive surpluses as well as excessive deficits. Another possibility is to get the IMF to do it in some way or another, but to make it clear that running a large surplus in itself is dangerous, not just for the countries receiving the savings, but also dangerous for the surplus country itself over the medium term. And again, more lessons from history I think would underline that particular story.
Well, the gloomy profession is living up to its name, but thank you very much for speaking. We do appreciate it. We like to give our guests something to remember the club by.